For me, I just like to get the vocal clean. So if it needs de-essing, I'll do that before compression and then a little bit after. You know, taking out 500 hertz, 300 to 500 hertz will save a vocal if it's over compressed. If I do parallel, I would use the mix knob on that device, because I've found that even with delay compensation, there's still a phasey thing that happens. I'm not a big fan of just like adding top end to vocals. There's a lot of people that do that, and I feel that that kind of sticks the vocal out away from the track. What I like to do is...
This episode is brought to you by Baby Audio. Today we explore mixing vocals in the box with Marc Daniel Nelson, a two-time Grammy-nominated mixing engineer and music producer. He has worked with iconic artists like Fleetwood Mac, Jason Mraz, and Johnny Mitchell. Hey Marc, thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Absolutely.
So the first question I have for you is, what's the biggest advantage of mixing vocals in the box?
In the box versus
analog,
like
on a console or whatever, yeah.
Well, I would say 1,000,000% automation, because as a mixer that would be stuck on a console with an insert of a compressor to an EQ and some reverb and stuff, your delays and everything, it would take quite a bit to automate everything you need. But it's not even about like automating like the effects. It's about automating EQ and compression. I mean, that's the benefit of having a DAW, is you can really go into every plugin on your vocal. And when things are pushing a little too hard only on spots, you can just tuck things in that area, either if it's a de-esser or EQ dynamically or compression. You can get so advanced that everything is just fluid by the end of it, and it just plays through. You could never do that in analog.
And is there anything you would do in analog that you wouldn't do in the box?
I mean, you can push a little harder in analog for sure. You can get away with a lot more in analog. You can EQ a little more, I feel like, in analog, and things seems to sit a little better. But I think in natural ways, like committing is always a big thing, because, a lot of people like to commit for other reasons. But for me, I like to commit if I'm tracking and sending it to a mixer, or I know I'm going to be mixing it. Committing effects, compression and stuff like that, not necessarily aggressive EQ or reverbs, but mainly compression. You just get that out of the way and you move on. Sometimes a lot of people kind of get hung up creatively dealing with, I'll save that for the mix, and then there's just too many options at that point. It's okay to commit. I mean, that's my opinion. Like, committing is incredibly, revealing to how you move your process forward, because you can just move on. And in about a week, you won't even remember if you were hung up on that or not. So you just don't want to like get into the creative juices and start worrying and like meddling between those two. That's my opinion.
Great. Do you start mixing with the vocals up, or do you prefer to bring them later?
Like some of my mentors really like to bring the vocals in right away. 15 years ago, watching these guys mix and process stuff. I think for me, I like to get the music right, because I think the drums and the bass are just as important as the vocal. It tells the same story, but just a completely different way. It creates an emotion that's just different. So I like to leave it off. I kind of do the fall down thing where it's drums and the bass and the guitars and keyboards, and then pulling synths and stuff in, orchestras, and then at the very end, pulling the vocal in. And I know a lot of people say by doing that, you're carving the vocal around the instruments. But in reality, I mean, I do pretty similar EQ moves other than like correction on almost all vocals. And it's not necessarily making them thinner to squeeze it into a louder, fatter track. It's more about getting things to sound really good on their own. Because back in the day, going back to analog, you would print a lot of stuff while you were going in. So when you were pulling stuff up, things just sounded really good. So a lot of people say, don't solo and EQ and stuff, but I don't believe in that. You should make your track sound great as is. obviously go back and keep things going with everything going on, so it kind of relates. But I think it's okay to do that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sometimes we don't get the vocals the way we want. So sometimes are maybe saturated or over compressed. What do you do when you have vocals like that? How can you fix
If
that?
you get something in that's over compressed and stuff,
Or saturated, or I don't know, maybe they chose the wrong mic or something like that.
yeah. I mean, to be honest, like de-essing is your fan, and I do a couple different stages of that. So if things are a little too pokey, you're just kind of focusing on what's the problem. So let's say the S's are too harsh, or there's a
Mm-hmm.
resonant in the high frequency because the microphone's cheap or something, or the room is giving into the mic. Focus on that. Tame just that area, and then everything else kind of balances out, and then it doesn't sound as boxy or compressed. Taking out 500 hertz, 300 to 500 hertz will save a vocal if it's over compressed too. Boosting 120 area to get some body, and then doing the scooping thing, and then retaining that poke of the harshness as well. Soothe obviously is a magic plugin. We all
Mm-hmm.
love that plugin. Um, I would say Isotope is your king for clipping and stuff that adds problems in your audio suites. You go back in and just focus on that stuff. It's tricky. The clarity plugin that is the kind of the denoiser for room ambience and stuff like that kind of keeps things down. It's weird. The more we go in this AI land where there's everything automatic, you can use those tools just sparingly to just kind of get certain things out of it. Because there could be a vocal that's completely clipped, and then you can find an app or something that's an AI app. You can inject your vocal into that, and just it might give you back a artificial thing for just that word. But what are you going to do if that vocal is already torched?
Mm-hmm.
You can do all sorts of stuff. Just be very cautious with that stuff, though. But if it's something where it's like Celine Dion, where she's so loud and she clips the mic and that's all you got, and it's just one word, but even if you're in the mix and you don't know what to do, like you've got tools to do that. Don't be scared, but also don't lean on the new stuff either, because people are getting real sloppy, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Sloppy. Yeah.
And the opposite. What do you do when the vocals have too much dynamics?
That's in the case using your template, at least for me, stacks of compressors. And I
Mm-hmm.
don't like really compressed vocals, but I like really upfront vocals. And I've just learned over time, you just gain a lot by stacking compressors doing very little. Like that MJUC, which is still one of the best sounding analog plug-in compressors, even if it's not even moving at the very loudest part of a song, and if it's just cutting off half dB, that's quite a lot for that sound. It really does compress. So if you, let's say that loudest part, this is kind of how I stack it. The loudest part of the song, the MJUC, just takes maybe a half dB off. Then below that, I use the CL1B, Tube
Mm-hmm.
Tech, Soft Tube, or UAD. That in a very easy setting, attacks and release fast and slow, taking off at the peaks 2 dB. Loudest. I'm talking loudest. So it's not even moving half the stuff. And then under that, a distressor, UAD, that's hitting maybe 2 dB. But that one seems to be kind of going off most of the time, because by the time you've come down, you've already hit quite a bit. And somebody will say, wow, that's like what, 7 dB of compression? But have you ever seen a vocal go through 1176 and
Mm-hmm.
not hit like 8 dB constantly? So you're hitting it, you're just kind of not creating a little bit of aggressive sound of it. So then the vocal is pretty smooth sounding and very upfront and even. And then you can add saturation and stuff like that. But in between there, you would add a couple de-essers. At least I would. And I really like the old Waves de-esser for my first de-essing. Just a little bit just to tame that. And then the fab filter. And if it needs more, we go back in and decide.
Mm-hmm. Would you ever put that de-esser before compression?
I think so. You could if it's aggressive. That's why you would use maybe one or two de-essers. Sometimes you put it on the track itself before it hits your bus. I think a lot of it is just depending on how aggressive it is, because you
Mm-hmm.
want to go into a compressor. Some people use a compressor to tame stuff like that. Like I know Ken Kelly used to use the 1176 all the time to tame aggressive peaks in the high frequencies. But then you're getting into that artifact sound. So for me, I just like to get the vocal clean. So if it needs de-essing, I'll do that before compression and then a little bit after. So you're not like leaning too hard on it and you're not depending on that first compressor biting down on anything that doesn't need to be there except for like a global. It's the same as EQ. Like you want to clean your low end out so your low end's not triggering compression either.
And the
Yeah.
other thing I've seen is like gaining down the sibilance on the vocals, like editing and turning down that sibilance before on the waveform. I mean, do you ever do that?
I used to do, well, yeah, I used to do a lot of that with clip gain,
Clip
the,
gain.
the
That's the
big,
word I was
the
looking
football.
for. Yeah.
Yeah. And they look like little footballs. The
Uh huh.
de-essing,
Yeah.
the S's always look like football. So it was really easy to just blast through it, but that does take quite a bit of
Uh
time.
huh.
If it's like a really, you know, thorough track that requires quite a bit of time and it's a big artist or something, I will go and do that. But then I'll
Mm-hmm.
also apply the others because the thing with the de-essers, it's becoming a sound now as well. It used to be like de-essing, you didn't want to hear these artifacts, and now some of these de-esser sounds are creating a little bit of distortion, and that's
Mm-hmm.
becoming a sound where people are familiar with that. So you kind of want to think about that too.
Mm.
It's weird, like all these tools have sounds, and a lot of them have distortion that you don't want to use, but all of a sudden there's been hits off that and
Mm-hmm.
people get very accustomed to those sounds, even if it's used incorrectly. And then you go, oh, I like it. It's kind of the nature of the beast.
Have you tried Baby Audio's plugins? They're designed to inspire creativity and enhance your music production experience. From their crystalline reverb plugin, offering ultra clean reflex free of metallic artifacts, to Spaced Out, a hybrid reverb and delay workstation that combines over 50 individual effects. Baby Audio provides tools that can transform your sound. Right now, you can get an exclusive discount on all their plugins. Just use the code Agartha15 at checkout. Don't miss out. Click the link in the description and elevate your music today.
Yeah.
So, when will you use multiband compressors or dynamic EQs on vocals?
Yeah. I mean, I still don't know the real difference. And there's a lot of snobby people out there that will say that. But like, I'll give you an example, the Fab Filter Dynamic
Mm-hmm.
versus the Fab Filter Multiband. They do sound different. I feel like the multiband is a lot quicker, but that could just be because they had more options at the time. That Spectrum thing that's going on Q4,
Mm-hmm.
which is a little different than the dynamic part, is very different than like Soothe, even though people are like, yeah, it's like Soothe. And it's like, well, not really. Soothe is funky because it's like a wave. It's creating all these neat things and it's choosing whatever, but you can globalize into it. Q4's Spectrum thing is really good for like low end of the vocal and stuff, that low chesty thing that you just used to just bring down with an EQ. But then if it sounds thin, this like literally just goes boop, 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 and then you're good. So it just depends, honestly.
Mm-hmm. And with your EQ vocals, do you usually start by cutting frequencies that bothers you, or then and then add the frequencies you want? Or
Yeah,
did
I
I say
think
that
that
right?
helps. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think that helps. To be honest, I think that is one of those things that if you're going in compression or you're going into a reverb, you want to get all that gunk out first.
Mm-hmm.
I know some people like to put EQ after. I do put EQ sometimes after to just, level it out with a little more brightness or sheen
Mm-hmm.
after you've kind of have your compression set. But I think going into the compressor with the vocal EQ'd correctly is really important, because then you're not hitting, if there's this boxiness or honkiness and then you're compressing it, it's just, you're just going back and you're as I say, going into that devil's triangle. You don't want to just go in circles.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, going into it with something like a Q4, do your chain of compression, and then maybe a sweetening EQ with like a channel strip EQ, 1073, or my plugin, the 455. I gotta keep plugging my plugins.
Mm-hmm.
Plug my plugins. That's a funny word to say. Yeah, the 455, which is an API EQ and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So that is a great EQ for just like global shaping, getting nice ambient top end and breathy stuff out of it, but doing surgical before the compression.
Cool. And do you usually high pass filters or use high pass filters on vocals?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's funny. Before then, it's again like if you've got any sort of low rumble and it fires off the compressor, you're exhausting stuff that doesn't need to be attacked. On top of that, like tracks are getting so full
Mm-hmm.
and so busy and stuff that like you just can't put that low fat vocal in on certain busy tracks. So you have to be very cautious. So like cutting that down at the bottom, cutting all that stuff off all the way up to, I don't know, 80 or 90 hertz, maybe 100 sometimes is really fine. I don't do the top roll off. I know some people do. It's interesting. It's probably something to experiment with considering we have, you know, flavors of albums that we love that were ever only on 44.1. That's a completely different EQ curve after, you know, high frequency of, I don't know, 16 or 12K. And then we have now, if you're recording at 96K and you're boosting on like an air EQ, like 20K, that's going to respond completely different, sound very different than stuff you're used to hearing back in the CD land, stuff like that.
At what sample rate do you like to mix now?
I'm around 48 still. I mean, I feel like that's a good thing. I was for years on 96, you know, working under Bill Schnee and Doug Sachs and these guys that wanted to keep everything as high res as you could get. I love that stuff. It does sound better, but efficiency wise, even today, and doing a lot of film stuff, everything kind of hovers around 48. I think it's a sweeter sound than 41. I don't know if I could call them the difference if I was told to, but I just feel like when I get something in 44.1, I can kind of tell it's a little different. 48 just seems to be a better. I never really gelled with 88.2 ever, ever. You know, there's been times where I can just instantly know it just because it's just, there's something there that doesn't fit with me right, which is weird because I gel with 48 and the double of that is 88. 96 is great. 192 is obviously amazing. If you've never recorded at 192 and then tried to mix with it, it's like, okay, I see why this is a big deal. But then again, when you bounce down and you go to mastering and you master it yourself, and then you have to put it up either at like a lossless file or whatever, it does lose its quality. So you got to be very cautious with, you know, all those scenarios.
You were talking about presence and clarity. So how do you add presence and clarity to the vocals without making them sound too harsh or sibilant?
That's a tricky one. Yeah, I don't. Obviously, you have to have a real clean mic. I mean, let's be realistic. The SM7, even a 57 with like a cloud lifter going in a good interface, and if you have a good, decent compression going in on an Apollo or whatever you're using, you can get some pretty good clean top end. But the thing is, we're getting further and further in better sounding rooms. So people are mixing and recording in not the greatest environments. And the top end is the first thing to have the problem in a bad room because it's the first thing you hear. It's early reflections, honkiness, that's overall vibe. If you're by glass or anything, it does come out. So I think maybe something like a Soothe or something like that to kind of soothe the top end, and then decide if that's going to help. And if it does, then you can add something like an air EQ. I'm not a big fan of just like adding top end to vocals. There's a lot of people that do that, and I feel that that kind of sticks the vocal out away from the track. What I like to do is get the vocal nice, where I feel like it's really good, get the instruments nice, have everything going, and then globally lift the whole thing up. Because then you're lifting the hi-hat and the percussion and every other acoustic guitars that have high frequencies. You're all bringing all those up together, phase locked in one, EQ versus doing it separately. And I'm talking just like slightly, but that's what we're talking about with top end. Usually you'd want to just use a better mic, but not everyone has that access.
Mm-hmm. How and when do you use saturation or distortion on vocals?
I think that depends on the track. I mean, everyone poo-poos Decapitator still, but I still feel like that's one of the best inventions in history.
Mm-hmm.
It's just such a unique sound still, and it sounds great, and it's really easy to kind of get some energy when you're not getting it. Got to be careful because it will get a little harsh, but I do feel like it does seem to help. It does seem to, add a little more energy. But if the track is not calling for it, don't do it, because the artist will hear it and they'll be like, what did you do? Why does it sound broken? But if it's something that sounds a little lo-fi, or a rock track for sure, or a pop track that is explosive at a point, that's another thing you can automate. You can keep it very low for the verses and stuff, and then when the instruments start kicking in, usually if there's distortion guitars or distortion synths, anything that has aggressive sound, that's where that usually works well, the saturator. And that could be a saturator from like Pulsar Modular has some really cool saturators. There's a lot. Klanghelm has some really, really inexpensive ones that are great. Obviously, Decapitator, stuff like that. Thermonic Culture is really cool. You just have to be cautious. So if you know that you're in a very energy aggressive track, that has that stuff, then you can bring it in a little bit. But if you just plop that on and it's a soothing track, it just sounds gimmicky and wrong, at least to my ear. And that's all you're thinking about. You're not listening to the song.
Mm-hmm. And do you ever use that distortion in parallel?
Parallel's really tricky for me. I like parallel on drums, piano for sure. Sometimes vocals, depending on what it is. If I do parallel, I would use the mix knob on that device, because I've found that even with like delay compensation, there's still a phasey thing that happens, because, distortion is all about the harmonics. So there could be some frequency that's not in time, correct? And you will hear it when you kind of drag in that other channel. And sometimes that's okay. There's no rules to say you can't do it, but you just got to be really cautious of hearing stuff, because you can start losing and putting like these weird pockets in your vocal that you didn't realize because you're doing a phase problematic parallel compression or parallel aggressive distortion.
And after that distortion, would you use something like soothe? So it's not, I forgot the word, or too harsh, I mean.
Yeah. Yeah, you got to be careful with soothe. I know I've said I like it a lot. I do, but I use it really sparingly. I know a lot of people put it on everything, including their stereo, and that's just like silly. It's like the trick with the de-essing. Like your mind hears, the second you hear an essing issue, you put a de-esser on it and you turn it off, and that's all you ever hear ever again. With Soothe, it's similar. That Clairphonic plugin back in the day was a big, huge hit. And it was very similar. We're like instant gratification, but then you're just causing something you didn't really need. Soothe, like if you're adding distortion, fix it in the distortion box, or fix it with the pre-EQ before it. If you know you're going to have like a bitey problem, fix it before it goes into it, because you're just stacking. And there's nothing wrong with stacking a little bit, but like to add another step with Soothe, you're getting into like weird morphing and stuff as well, and you're losing a lot of impact that way. And the vocal is really critical with impact for sure.
What are your favorite ways to add depth and dimensions to a vocal?
Well, it's a mono, unless it's backgrounds, and those, top lines on hip hop and stuff like that are a little different, because those tend to be a little more punchy. I would say, it's all about the pre-delay and reverbs. It's all about the automation that you do at the post after your mix is sitting really good, deciding that. I like to automate my pre-delays between verses and choruses because, when the chorus hits and you add more, sometimes I like double, multiply times 2 that pre-delay setting. If it's 80, I'll do 160 on the chorus. All of a sudden you're adding a pocket on the vocal. So the reverb's not really changing other than the pre-delay, but it sounds like you just did this, which is really cool because you're separating that. So that's a cool little trick.
And would
I'm wondering
you?
if everyone has the same answers. Does everyone have the same
No, no,
answers?
no, no, no. And would you automate that pre-delay on the Reverb
Yeah.
plugin?
Yeah.
Because what I do is I have a delay, but before the Reverb, just for that. Because for me, it's way easier to, I don't know,
Yeah.
to automate that.
I mean, it's just all about the automation because, and you can do it just flying. You can do it like even without sound because if you're getting used to the specific sound of knowing how it works, it really works well. And like you can just go, okay, this is going to be automated on the plugin, and I'm going to go back to the vocal and automate the vocal. Send going in so I can lift up the reverb a little more on the chorus, and then the pre-delay kicks in double time, and then it goes into some other thing. It doesn't have to be like unison mathematically to the song either. And that's going back to echoes and stuff. Like I'm a big fan of tap and stuff, but I'm also a huge fan of stuff that doesn't even make sense in time because it causes a little tension. And I think that's something we're losing in music making. We're trying to make things a little too clean and perfect. And I've always leaned into heavier bass, heavier drums because it makes people a little uneasy. It's not safe. Same with vocals and delays. By adding stuff that's a little random and not right, mathematically, time-wise, it just creates a little tension. And if you're trying to get a message across in your song and you add a little psychology there with tension and the delays, you might not realize it, but that's what's happening, kind of a thing. It's kind of cool. It's kind of cool.
Yeah, totally agree with that. Talking about effects and reverbs, how do you make sure the reverb doesn't muddy your vocals on the mix or the mix?
I think a lot of people like that ducker option that's available now. You got to be careful with that one too, where you're ducking your vocal and it's kind of pulsing around it and the reverb's kind of coming up. There's a couple ways to do that. I don't do that a lot. I do it sometimes when the artist or the producer comes back and they're like, I just want the reverbs to be a little more around the vocal, but not louder. And that usually helps that. I would say changing different reverbs between each section is really critical. In my template, I have 3, 4 reverbs always set kind of where they're at. And half the time I might even turn them on. But I do know that by listening to modern records, it's all about keeping the audience member or the listener engaged and focused. So by changing little things, even if it's 2 different companies of their plate at the same setting, same decay, they're going to sound a little different. You will feel that. You will feel these little changes. And those are little interesting things that the audience might not pick up, but they might feel something changed, which is really kind of a cool trick.
And how do you make the reverb stand out when there's not much space in the mix?
Yeah, that's a hard one. Pre-delay, making, a little ducking, again, going at the ducking, that is not necessarily something I do all the time, but I definitely do it on really dense stuff, certainly on endings of massive choruses when it needs it. Automating that. Longer reverbs are really good. I'm not a huge fan of super short reverbs on vocals. Actually, I do like it on like the intros and stuff, but it's all about kind of smearing the vocal without a ton of compression. And the word smear is probably the wrong word, but something that is like that kind of grips the vocal in place. And you can put a delay before the reverb physically. and it's throwing delay into the reverb, and that creates its own glue and stew to kind of
Mm-hmm.
stew in, literally. But I think honestly, when it gets so dense and stuff, I tend to kind of grab like ridiculously big reverbs, like 4 to 6 second decays, very dense. You know, the 224 has a great setting. Sean Everett has a great setting on that.
Mm.
That is so dense that like you wouldn't even hear it, but you can just feel it, and it seems to push the vocals a little better when things get a little crazy. Because you don't really want to hear it. You don't want it to sound like you're in an auditorium, or not even an auditorium, a freaking baseball stadium or something. But it does, when you're putting it underneath things, tend to kind of create its own depth, but its own vibe too, almost like a synthesizer, because it's so dense that it helps the vocal kind of push through.
I'm gonna try that.
Yeah,
Definitely.
sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes it just like,
But
yeah, why not? We got time.
yeah. What about EQ? Do you EQ sometimes those reverbs?
Yeah, I do. Sometimes it's like it's really needed because you want it to sit in the box of the aggressive side. I mean, I used to totally EQ reverbs when we used to have hardware reverbs that weren't like 480s or 224s or 960s or something like that, 250s or 140. Those are all beautiful and they seem to sit well. But then when we get into like a SPX 90 or the PZM lower level ones, they're a little brighter and a little harsher. So we were tending to EQ those reverbs a lot more then. But I do know that there's a lot of guys out there that's part of their sound, is EQing the returns a lot. And it just becomes its own universe. And sometimes I remember being young thinking you can't do that for some reason. Oh, you can't touch that. They worked real hard for that sound. And it's like, no, we can do anything we want. We can do anything we want.
And do you ever compress those reverbs?
Yeah. Yeah. You can try all sorts of stuff. I don't like to do that because I'm a big natural kind of ambient guy. I love the Bracasti hardware. I love my EMT 250 digital reverb, the hardware that I have. And those are just so beautiful that like when you start like augmenting that sound, it does start getting into that vibe that's not necessarily so like attractive because it's just easier to just compress stuff. But if it gets a little kooky, you can. I'm just a massive automation guy. I tend to lean into hand volume automation more than anything, and that's a lot on vocal reverbs for sure.
And what's your favorite technique to get like an in-your-face vocal?
I think going back to the stacking of the compression, lightly compression, is really critical. There is that one, I think it's called the UC1. Is that right? Waves UC1. Is that right? It's basically the low level and the high level. I don't have Pro Tools.
MV2?
Oh, yeah, the MV2. Yeah. I've always been a huge fan of that, and I've been the vocal of that for a while. Like, you got to get this. And I don't know what. Oh, UC1's an SSL thing. There's too many names. We got to get away from names. Why can't we name it like Thor and like the Ravaged Beast or something like that instead of like 166362009? Yeah, the MV2. That's great. That's a great one. I actually found that on a Colby Calais thing back in 2014 that was like an aha moment. So if you have your chain going and everything like that, you're really happy with how everything's sitting, but you just want it to be way more modern and in your face, that MV2 is just terrific. I know a lot of people like the RVox. That's a cool one too. But the MV2 seems to be one of those things where you got to be cautious with how much low level you're bringing up. But like just by doing the squeeze a little bit, it just instantly brings it up to that very modern vocal. Very, very cool.
And are there times when you use sidechain on an instrument to make the vocal stand out better?
Yeah, I was thinking about that the other day. What's the plugin, the track?
Wave Fact? No,
Wave Fact.
That's the brand, right? I can
Yeah, I
remember the
thought
name.
you know what I'm talking about, the one knob.
Mm-hmm.
That's in my template on a lot of instruments because it's a really good way to do that kind of pulse thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it works amazing on like dialogue when you have a dialogue talking over music because you're kind of doing this with the music, but then you're affecting the music. And me being a guy that doesn't love a lot of compression on the stereo bus, by doing that to the vocal, you're doing this to the vocals instrumental
Mm-hmm.
music section, and that can get a little messy. So sometimes I just choose instruments inside of it that I'm going to focus on the vocal with, usually a bass that's slower, something that's thicker like pads or something that can kind of glue around the vocal. Because if you start doing it on the drums and stuff, sometimes it works great when you do it on the drums. But if you do it too much, sometimes it's just almost like you're just ducking and you just starts becoming a
Mm-hmm.
problem.
And when you feel the
Yeah.
vocal, when you feel the vocals lack character, what are your favorite techniques to fix that?
I think that MJUC is one of the greatest fixers of not great sounding microphones. Just the insert quality of that. My new plugin, the P821, which is a tape machine plugin.
Mm-hmm.
We found that has been extreme success with getting vocals that aren't great sounding instantly better because of the way it positions stuff and smooths it. On
Mm-hmm.
background vocals, it sounds like, I call it lacquer, adds this really beautiful sheen. So anything that's like an instant character. If you're adding distortion, make sure that distortion's unique. If you're using Decapitator, there's like 5 presets at the bottom. All those buttons do sound different. Try those out. They're
Mm-hmm.
cool.
Yeah. And when the vocals feel disconnected from the mix, how do you bring them together?
Yeah, that's another one that I fought the other week. Last week I had a track I was mixing and it was like listening. I knew it was recorded incredibly well.
Mm-hmm.
It was a track from England at a really good studio and everything came in and the ref sounded fine. It was just like a up mix. But then I got the vocal going and then it just wasn't sitting right. And you start going, well, I know that's an extremely expensive vocal chain and great instruments and the arrangement's great, but sometimes things just don't sit.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where certain things, like I said, like the changing up, the ducking, doing stuff that's a little different, you got to pull out those tricks and try them. Don't just add them instantly, but try them, because what you're going to find is you're going to do something that's very different and not normal. And then if it becomes a real success, the song, people are going to think that was intentional. And then you're going to be known for being this amazing guy that did something that was not supposed to be done. But it's usually like leaning on something a little more, compression that's a little more aggressive just to have it just tuck under. I don't like to hear vocals too quiet. And I don't like to hear vocals way louder than the instruments. I find that to be very boring, and anyone can do that as an engineer. So there's that critical moment. But if you automate in like a dynamic EQ or a multiband compressor, that low mid area around 200 to 500, and get a little more aggressive while it goes, that's the area that things kind of tend to get a little honky and boxy on vocals. So in a busy track, you don't have to have it engaged until it gets busy. Just pulling that and tucking that down and keeping some of your low end going and your top is the same, you're going to get this thing where it's just kind of sitting in a track a lot easier.
And if you
A
want
lot
to,
of people want to put shit all over things. They
Yeah,
want
I
to
know.
put reverb and delay and stuff. And I just say, really use automation. It's just amazing.
do you automate with a mouse, or do you? I don't know. Do you have a like a controller?
I have a
Right?
UF8,
Uh-huh.
yeah, and I still have my infamous fader port,
It
which
works.
is a one channel. Oh, it was great. I still have all high hopes with using your mouse. The funny thing is, you start on a console, you get used to touching stuff. And then the more we go into the era we're in, you get used to just being like this. Your right hand is on a mouse, your left hand is on the keyboard. The way I have it set up, I can obviously change 8 faders and everything's good. And I'm really fast with that. But I do a lot of clip gain automation.
Mm-hmm.
I just feel like that is just a lot easier and it's just a lot more permanent versus you can do a wave band EQ and then accidentally mess it up and forget and stuff like that. So sometimes I like to do the clip gain and then put the volume over it to protect it. It's almost like a gatekeeper over the clip gain.
And if you want to create a sense of intimacy or closeness in a vocal, what do you do?
That's a proximity thing, I think. When you're trying to be really like intimate and beautiful, it doesn't mean you're adding the voice of God where it just sounds like a radio, but you can add this versus this. And like this sounds fine when you're playing piano and guitar, but when you're really trying to get it right, there's a fine line between that and that and that.
Mm-hmm.
So like that's like the sweet spot. So the intimacy thing to me is the pre-delay, lighter compression, more automation, focus with the fader that you're not hearing the electronics do its thing, and just the right proximity. And by getting proximity afterwards, there's a lot of different plugins you can do it, but easily just doing a nice tight bell on a vocal and automating that to get a little more and just be a little more adjustable. You can add, let's say 2 dB at 120, and it might just sound too much. But then if you put that spectrum thing back in, it's just tucking the little weirdness, like the little flyaway hairs of the low end. And it works out really good, actually. And it's a lot of fun because you're being creative when you're making these moves. It's not just slapping this on. We're not in the era of just putting on an 1176. And you can be if it's the type of music, but like if it's dense, you got to be really with it.
How would you fix a vocal with too much bleeding from the rest of the instruments?
Yeah, that was an interesting one. I was a executive producer on a PBS series back in my old Chicago studio. And we did in studio, I think we did 36 different ones. And it was a band in a room. Sometimes I was isolating the guitars or the horns and stuff, but the vocal was always in the room with the drum set. And at that time, they didn't have, ozone or any sort of way to take it down. Gating sounded gimmicky and fake. I was hand automating and still do, because I feel like getting some of that drums and stuff in the vocal mic at sometimes at specific levels actually adds to the vibe because it's ambience as well. But if it's too much, there's plenty of plugins that really work and cut things out. That CL, I can't remember what it is, but the Waves one that just came out is extremely good. That you just turn the one knob and it just gets quieter.
Clarity?
And quieter
Is it Clarity or
in the room? Clarity. Yeah. Clarity. That's in my vocal template. I do like to hand automate still. I'm not a guy that just strips stuff out. I still feel like you're losing quality, even if you're not, or they say you're not. I've done stuff in the past where I worked on some Joni Mitchell stuff, and she recorded at A&M back in the 70s, and band in the room within 5 feet of her. There's conga going, there's acoustic guitars. She's playing acoustic guitar in her vocal, and there's a KM54 on her guitar. And there's everything coming in her vocal mic. And so we had to cut that out somehow. We didn't want to use full AI. I don't think it was strong enough at the time. We did use isotope, and I was able to plug in the conga track, because that was the thing that was boop, boop, kept popping into her vocal. That was just driving me crazy. But I was all worried that if you start processing the vocal, it's going to throw the phase out of the acoustic guitar. But it didn't, because isotope is crazy. When you program it correctly and it calculates, it keeps the phase lock still, which is crazy. But you can inject, almost like key in the track that you're trying to pull down, because I didn't want to take it out. I just wanted to pull it down by like 10, 15 dB. And we injected that track of the conga, and it brought it down. It was amazing. So there is a thing called debleed in isotope that works really well. Obviously now everything, you can just strip anything. But again, it just doesn't sound, you can hear this like aliasing thing because it almost is like you're getting back an MP3 or AI that's not necessarily accurate. So just be very cautious, because then your plugins start acting different too.
Now I have a couple of questions from our audience. And the first one is, what are you using on your mix bus?
In the box, that's 455. That's my plugin. That's based on my hardware. Sidechain, no, not sidechain, but sidecar, API sidecar. And then I have an AT101, which is a 670 compressor hardware that is outstanding. And it uses the real transformers and the real tubes of the real thing, not just a emulation of what they thought it could be. It's 100% right. And just using that line amp alone on the stereo is really, really great. The old Tube Tech multiband on the stereo, either through the soft tube in the box or hardware, is terrific. That 455 is great. And going back and plugging my new one, the 821 tape machine, it's great too on the stereo bus, because that one does something to low end that I've never heard done. And many, many people over the last week have just been like, how is this doing it? Because it takes a bass guitar and pulls it back behind the speakers. But it doesn't, it appears to be bass is getting fatter, but it's not adding low end. It's really interesting. So that's on my stereo. I do like the old ATR still a little bit. Not as much now that I've got my own tape plugin that works better for me, for my taste. It just depends. I still kind of mix out of the box sometimes, depending on if I feel like it for the day. I still like to kind of calibrate stuff and feel like a real engineer versus just using all, in the box. But I would say I'm definitely 50-50 these days. 50-50 in the box versus out, depending on the project. It's pretty cool. And I think that's kind of relatively, I don't like I like compressors. I have a lot of different compressors, but I don't like to use it aggressively. So let's say I'm using the SSL 2-bus plus. I like to use that with mix mode, maybe 40% on, and then put the sidechain on. So I'm not even touching the low end. So I'm just focusing on areas of the stereo image to just kind of clamp and just get down a little bit. Hydrating the track a little bit, meaning like trying to expand it, is dangerous. There's all these gimmicks that I feel that are in plugins and limiters that like you can get really in the weeds or ahead of your skis very quickly. So you got to be very cautious with that. I mean, I was just talking to Dave Pensato about this, and like he does not like to use bus compression, which you would think he would, as much as he uses it time to time, but like he's just like, I just don't like it. And the more I talk to around the town and stuff, people are getting away from that a little bit, because we got so into using these things, but you do need to get the level up. So you have to find ways to make sure you can do that. I'm not anti it. And there's certainly guys that can do it. Like CLA is the best at what he does. And he uses so much compression. It's insane. But there's no one better for that style, in my opinion. He's so good at that. But I could never do that. Like my mind cannot operate like that. And I don't know how he does it. And I don't know how his brother does it. And these other great mixers that just, Spike Stent, another one that just loves to use a lot of aggressive compression. It's a sound. It's a taste thing. It's an energy thing for sure.
And all this processing you were talking about on your mix bus, do you start like when you start the mix, do you turn them right away on? I mean, do you turn them on right away, or maybe at I don't know, half of the process, or maybe later?
Yeah, my 455, I have like a setting I always kind of like to start with, and that is the 0.5 click on the EQ, 50 hertz on, 1 click up, 250 off, 1 click down, 10K up, 1 click up. And at 0.5, it basically subtracts times 2. So you're only doing a half dB. And either a 20 or 40 high pass, just to get some of the gunk out. And I will turn it off. And on that plugin, it has an option where it has a converter choice. So I can choose between Willie or Atticus, which is a Labrie or a JCF converter. They both have very own personality as a converter. The drums change, the stereo image change. But I'll start with it on the left. I'll start with the line amp on, and then I'll turn it off. We'll start the mix and keep going. And when I feel like it's starting to get really good, then it's like that reward when you put it in, you're like, there it is. It just starts instantly setting it off. I know that's a thing that a lot of guys like to do because it's just like it's a little reward. You spend a little time, you get it to get sitting right, and you're like, this is sounding great. And then your mind thinks, how can I get it better? And then you put something in. Sometimes it doesn't work. Most of the time it does. But usually putting that in, you're expanding the low end in a proper way, phase-wise, and bringing up the top proper way, phase-wise, with unison of a lot of instruments, and clearing some of that low muddiness down at the below, 300 and above the bass stuff and the snare. And that's just a really good starting place. And if it's wrong or it doesn't feel right, I can switch over to the other converter, which is Atticus, which is the JCF. And what that does, it just shifts things a little different. It can make the vocal sit back a little bit because response of these converters, they just have their own personality. And usually between those two, I get a really good sweet spot. Really cool.
Nice. Is there anything you automate in your mix bus?
Not really. Maybe a little bit EQ. I've been playing with my 821 with automation, and I like the shelves and the bias. The bias is not necessarily an EQ. It's more like, I call it like a constipation knob, where like if you feel like the low is getting like just really tight and not great, you back that knob off a little bit and it just kind of opens it up without kind of shifting your EQ of your low end. So by automating that, it does seem to kind of be nice when the song gets a little busy. That's pretty cool.
Nice. I have another question here is, do you like using clippers? What do you use them for?
Yeah, clippers are important now. If it's a track that's extremely loud and heavy and you need to retain it and your ref that you were given is so loud that you can't even compete, sometimes soft clipping doesn't work the best. The Lavery Savitar, if I'm saying that right, the hardware, which is a really ridiculously expensive A to D, but it clips so great that you can get level for days on your stereo bus. But like the standard clip, I've always been a huge fan of, and that's extremely affordable. There's that gold clip that's really great too. There's just a lot of things. Even going back to the FGX Slates limiter had an interesting clipper built into the whole apparatus that sounds really cool on drums. I know a lot of people kind of not abandoned it, but moved on because there's been other options over the last 12 years. Go back to that thing. That thing's really rad.
Cool.
Totally about cutting off just the little top stuff, but like using my 821, using a tape plugin like my tape plugin that was designed to kind of authentically get those little peaks off without sounding like compression or limiting. That helps a lot too. If you're just trying to shave a little bit off of the acoustic guitars and your snare, that works really well.
So you just released your plugin. So what's the name of the plugin again? So
new plugin is called P821 MDN tape, based on my personal Stevens 821 that was from the Producer's Workshop here in Hollywood that was known for doing like The Wall and Steely Dan Asia and Rumors. It was just known for being extremely hi-fi, and the tape machine is kind of a cult machine because, and a lot of people have said this, that it is the best sounding machine because it was extremely bizarrely put together by this guy that was such a strange dude, the Stevens fella, that just knew what he was doing. And there's no transformers in it. It's extremely light, so light that I can literally take the transport and put it above my head. And, give you a reference, like Ken Kelly recorded most of the basics of Rumors in Sausalito on a 3M. That 3M machine had transformers and stuff. By the time they were doing overdubs and stuff, that tape got destroyed. And they went and recorded all over the country on a first tour while they were working on this album. By the end, right before mixing, they found that they had to do some more guitar overdubs and do some fixes on some drum stuff and stuff like that. And they did a first day mixing at Sound City, and that Neve was just too like empowering on the mix, gluey and fat. It was just too much for the track because the track was already starting to lose its life. So Ken decided to come back to Producer's Workshop because people kept talking about this Stevens machine. And from Ken's mouth recently, because we talked a ton about it while we were building this plugin, he just basically said it was like putting all that polish back on silverware. It was insane. Like all the distortion, all the flatness just went away because every other machine they put it through, it's going through all this electronics that's taming and pulling down the sound, the transients. And this just kept it everything open. And that's kind of the personality of the machine. And someone the other day said, why are you making a tape machine of a clean tape machine? I'm like, because it's the sound of tape. And that's the magic. That's like the magic of like tape is obviously we love transformers and stuff, but like the sound of tape is all about like that natural compression that is just remarkable. And I didn't want to build something where when you drive it, it just sounds like you're driving a guitar pedal. And a lot, if not all tape plugins that I've tried, you start driving in and it just distorts. And that's fine because tape machines do that. But the one thing we were allowed to do, Pulsar, Ziad, and myself, when we designed this was to take that out a little bit and not just go into distortion. So we were allowed to have it do its remarkably odd compression thing. The harder you push into tape without the whole like giant hold on the distortion aspect of that stereo, if that makes sense. So yeah, 821. It's coming out. Should be out by the time we talk, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
So keep an eye on it.
So, Marc, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I had a great time talking to you.
It was a lot of fun. It's great. You know, I haven't thought about vocals this deep, and like I probably should have did a little more research, but I think everything just came out pretty good, right?
Yeah, of course. So
That's
thank you
great.
once again.
Thank you for having me for sure.